The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, whose ideas are very much so anti-Christian, is vastly understudied by Christian and particularly Catholic theologians, in part because many of Sartre's contributions to 20th century philosophy were superseded by the more deconstructive types, postmodernists, in the second half of the 20th century, followers of Derrida, Foucault, Judith Butler, etc., the ones who very much so influence the kind of progressivist streams within contemporary academia. The postmodernists went beyond the kind of Cartesian presuppositions of Sartre's philosophy. Nonetheless, many of the ideas that Sartre proposes show up in modern culture in ways that are particularly nefarious. And so I think Sartre's ideas should be studied more precisely and more comprehensively by Catholic theologians. I want to focus upon his magnum opus, in many ways one of his early works, Being and Nothingness. In Sartre's idea of the gaze, the self recognizes the eyes of the other, or that is to say, the fact that I recognize that the other recognizes me. So here's the order. I first objectify the other. I notice and observe the other as a something within my field of vision. But this something cannot be a mere object, like the chair upon which I'm sitting or the window beside me. That is to say, as mere objects within the field of my own intentional consciousness, within the horizon of my subjecthood. The other reveals his own subjecthood when he looks back at me. And so my self-consciousness, which at this point in the logical progression of the book had lacked intersubjectivity, recognizes the fact that the other is a subject gazing upon me. So what happens when the other looks back at me? When he pierces my subjectivity with his gaze, which need not be a physical gaze, but merely the presence of someone, like somebody hiding behind a curtain or behind a door. And so my self-consciousness is shaped by the fact that I recognize myself and am defined by the gaze of the other. Or it is my internalization of the essentializing gaze of the other, that I recognize the fact that the other is defining me by his gaze. This results in a reflexive event. I recognize that you recognize me. And by recognizing that you recognize me, I impose onto myself the essence that you impose onto me. Initially, I have pure freedom, sort of this idea that Sartre proposes that the human subject is an existence before it has an essence. But in the gaze of the other, I am alienated, fundamentally, from those infinite possibilities in the face of the infinite freedom of the other. And so, this is somewhat verbose, but my transcendence is transcended by the transcendence of the other. In other words, the other defines me, limits me by his essentializing gaze. And so I give up my own being as potentiality through my own shame in the face of his gaze. Sartre says that my alienation is a consequence of, or is constitutive of, my own resignation of my potentiality, the possibilities in front of me, and so I am subordinated to the other. My contention is that Sartre's description of the alienating content of the gaze as my transcendence transcended is a kind of synthesis of Sartre's reading of Descartes, Hegel, Marx, and Heidegger. From Descartes, Sartre positions his articulation of the cogito, the I think, as something that precedes the self's awareness of the body, and so self-consciousness that exists before it recognizes its own bodiliness. And so self-consciousness in relation to the other initially has a kind of pre-bodily form, or that is to say, it's sort of the condition of bodiliness itself. In Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, the Lord-bondsman relationship, in the sublation of self-consciousness through the recognition of another consciousness, which is the first moment of, or the first appearance of spirit, gives Sartre some foundation for articulating the initial intersubjective relationship as dialectical, that is to say, in opposition rather than dialogical, that is to say, in conversation or in some kind of interior and positive relationship. Building on Hegel, Marx's theory of alienation, in which there's this separation between the laborer and the labor, and therefore this alienation between the labor and the laborer, provides Sartre with a further foundation for articulating the dialectical relationship. Finally, Heidegger's phenomenology gives Sartre some foundation for being able to talk about existence in a way that is not preconditioned by essences. Okay, so how do we confront Jean-Paul Sartre from a Catholic perspective? I propose to draw upon St. Thomas Aquinas' transcendental metaphysics and Trinitarian theology as a way of presenting a Catholic alternative to Sartre's understanding of intersubjectivity, which I think is an understanding of intersubjectivity that's quite common now, especially on social media, a dialectical relationship between subjects. So, for St. Thomas, what is the relationship between the good and being? So in the thing itself, that is to say metaphysically, the good and the being of the thing are identical. They refer to the same reality. However, logically or cognitionally, in the structure of our thinking, the good and being as transcendental properties can be logically distinguished. So the good refers to the desirability of the thing, whereas being refers to the perfection of the thing insofar as it is actual, that is, insofar as it has some existence. So in the logical order, being precedes goodness insofar as you have to consider the fact that a thing has existence before you can consider the fact that a thing is desirable. So if being is prior to the good in the order of thought, though substantially the same in the order of metaphysics, what then is the relationship between the true and the good as transcendental properties? Similar to the good, the true is interchangeable with being, metaphysically, but it is conceptually distinct insofar as it refers to some aspect of being. And so this logical structure mirrors the faculties or the operations in the soul. And so the intellect, in knowing the object through cognition, through apprehension, precedes the operations of the will. In simpler terms, knowing precedes loving. But knowing and loving are deeply interrelated. Most importantly, the way in which we know the true and love the good mirrors the intra-Trinitarian structure. So this is based on the psychological analogy of the Trinity, that we can know something about the processions of the Son and the Holy Spirit by looking at the way that our soul is structured. The Son proceeds from the Father by way of word, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son by way of love, which mirrors the way in which the soul, the human soul, knows and loves the thing in the immediate horizon of that soul's cognition. So because the human person is made in the image and likeness of God, the human person reflects, in an imperfect way, the perfection of the intra-Trinitarian life. So having laid down this Thomistic foundation, how can we address and answer Sartre's more negative assessment of intersubjectivity? So what would a Thomistic understanding of intersubjectivity look like? Contra Sartre, intersubjectivity begins with a moment of knowledge and love. First, being is good, and being as good is substantially united to the true, and creaturely being participates in the perfection of being in God, and God is truth and goodness, absolutely speaking. And so the substantial relational structure of the Trinity, that the Son is Word, and that the Spirit is love who proceeds through and from the Son as Word, is the exemplar, is that ultimate and perfect reality that is reflected in our own epistemic and volitional structure. So our cognitive structure can be understood in Trinitarian terms. Within the structure of our human personhood, we do have some essence, and that essence mirrors the reality of God fundamentally. If this is the case, and given the fact of the imago Dei, the image and likeness of God, the basic operations of our subjecthood cannot be this kind of infinite freedom that in turn is realized in terms of alienation in the face of the gaze of the other, which is really a condition of original sin. Rather, the most basic impulse of our subjecthood is an operation of love that's grounded in the apprehension of that which is true. We recognize the other as a person who is loved by God, and we recognize the truth of that person before we love that person as loved by God. And so St. Thomas's teaching concerning the intellect and will is a better description of the manner in which we interact with others. While Jean-Paul Sartre is really describing the experience of hell, St. Thomas Aquinas is describing first, on the level of our nature, the integrity of our cognition, and then second, on the level of supernature, the experience of beatitude and the communion of saints.